Allison never thought she would see Mark again. After the trial, she had left their shared town of Everwood and relocated 2 counties over, trying to piece together a life that no longer bore his shadow. Over the years, she remarried, a quiet, patient man named Daniel Warren, who offered the stability Allison had craved for so long. In prison, Mark stewed over Allison's betrayal. He convinced himself that she had orchestrated everything, that she had exaggerated the attack to get rid of him and move on to a new life. Mark didn't acknowledge his guilt, not even in therapy sessions designed for parole evaluations. What kept him going was the fantasy of confronting Allison one day and exposing her as a liar. When Mark was paroled after 10 years, he didn't immediately make a scene. He was strategic. He returned to Everwood, rented a small apartment under a different last name, and started gathering information. Through social media, public records, and quiet observation, he found out that Allison now lived in the nearby town of Brookhaven, married, childless, and working as a high school guidance counselor. Mark's resentment deepened when he saw Allison's wedding photos online. Her new life seemed perfect, sanitized, as if he had never existed. To him, this wasn't just about revenge. It was about rewriting history. Mark wasn't interested in reconciliation or even confrontation. Deep down, he wanted destruction. Meanwhile, Allison had no idea he was out. The parole board was supposed to notify her. But somewhere in the bureaucracy, the letter was lost. She lived her days in cautious peace, unaware that the man she once testified against was plotting his next move. Mark spent the first few weeks acclimating to life outside prison walls. His parole officer, a tired man named Don Whitaker, insisted on routine check-ins and job applications, but Mark treated it as an inconvenience. His real job was surveillance. Mark bought a used pickup truck with cash and spent hours parked outside of Brookhaven High School, pretending to be a construction worker taking measurements. It was there he first saw Allison again, walking across the parking lot in the early morning light, professional, smiling at colleagues, a folder tucked under her arm. For a moment, rage threatened to overtake him, but Mark reminded himself, patience. He started learning her patterns. Monday through Friday, Allison worked at the high school until 3:30 p.m. every Wednesday evening. She attended a local book club at the Brookhaven Library. Weekends were less predictable but often involved errands at the local grocery store, sometimes with her husband. Mark never followed her directly, never enough to be noticed. He understood how to stay invisible. Meanwhile, Allison began to notice strange things, the feeling of being watched when she walked to her car, footsteps that seemed to echo hers when the parking lot was empty, minor disturbances, her mailbox door swinging open when she was sure she had latched it, the back gate to her yard left ajar. At first, she chalked it up to nerves. Her past had taught her to second-guess her instincts. But one night, after leaving book club, she found a scrap of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. You can never erase the past. There was no signature, no handwriting she could recognize. She froze in the parking lot, scanning the darkness. Her first instinct was to call Daniel, but she hesitated. She didn't want to sound paranoid. Still, the pit of fear that settled in her stomach didn't fade. At home, she locked all the doors and windows, something she hadn't done so obsessively in years. Daniel noticed her anxiety, but assumed it was seasonal stress. End-of-year testing always weighed heavily on Allison. She didn't tell him about the note. Meanwhile, Mark, watching from a distance, smiled. He knew the first seeds of doubt had been planted. The next few days were quiet, almost suspiciously so. Allison forced herself to believe the note had been a random act by a high school prankster, but her subconscious wouldn't relax. She started double-checking her locks every night, glancing over her shoulder in the grocery store, and keeping the curtains drawn during the day. Mark watched patiently. He understood that fear was most effective when it ebbed and flowed, not when it struck all at once. The next escalation came a week later. When Allison left her shift at the high school, she noticed something peculiar. Her car, which she had locked that morning, now had the glove compartment open. Nothing was missing. Not her wallet, not her documents, but someone had been inside. She felt a wave of nausea as she scanned the near-empty parking lot. She drove home trembling, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles went white. That night, she finally told Daniel. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Allison recounted the incidents, the open gate, the windshield note, and now the car break-in. Daniel listened patiently, but a shadow of skepticism crossed his face. "Maybe it's kids," he said gently. "You know how it gets at the end of the school year. Senior pranks, bored teenagers." Allison nodded, forcing a smile, but inside she felt a deep, gnawing loneliness. Daniel wasn't dismissing her, not exactly. He just didn't understand. He had never lived with the constant low hum of dread the way she had during her first marriage. Meanwhile, Mark made a new move. Using a prepaid cell phone, he called the school's landline anonymously and asked to leave a message for Mrs. Warren. The receptionist, unsuspecting, jotted it down. "I'm back. M." The school secretary handed Allison the note later that afternoon. Allison's hands shook so violently she almost dropped it. This time, there was no mistaking it. Allison excused herself, locking herself in the staff bathroom, and tried to steady her breathing. M could only mean one person. Her mind raced. She had to know for sure. Had Mark been released? But when she contacted the victim notification unit later that night, they apologized profusely. Due to a system glitch, she had never been informed. Yes, Mark Reed had been released 6 weeks ago. Yes, he was supposed to be living in Everwood under parole supervision. No, they had no information suggesting he was violating the terms of his release. Allison hung up, her heart pounding. He was free, he was close, and he was watching her. That night, Allison couldn't sleep. She kept imagining Mark outside the window, lurking just beyond the reach of the porch lights. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made her jolt upright. At 3 a.m., she finally slipped out of bed and sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. She knew she had to tell Daniel everything, not just about the new threats, but about the depth of Mark's past violence. Up until now, Daniel only knew the general outlines. Allison had survived a bad marriage. She had never told him the full story, the beatings, the hospital stays, the night she had crawled into a neighbor's yard, barely breathing, while Mark ransacked their home in a drunken rage. When Daniel stumbled into the kitchen half asleep, he found her there, still in her robe, pale and wide-eyed. "Allison, what's going on?" She told him everything. The original attack, the trial, the 10-year sentence, and now the stalking. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. His face was an unreadable mask. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "Why didn't you tell me all this before?" Allison's voice broke. "I wanted to start over. I thought, if I pretended it wasn't part of me, maybe it wouldn't follow me here." Daniel rubbed his temples. "We should call the police, tonight." They did. A patrol car arrived within 20 minutes. Officer Jessica Nolan, young but professional, took down Allison's statement. She was sympathetic but cautious. "Unfortunately," Nolan said, flipping through her notepad, "unless he physically threatens you or violates a no-contact order, there's not much we can do yet. I recommend filing for a protective order first thing tomorrow." It wasn't enough. Allison knew it. A piece of paper wasn't going to stop Mark. The next morning, she took off work and spent 3 hours at the courthouse filing the paperwork for a restraining order. But she learned it would take at least 72 hours for the order to be reviewed by a judge. Until then, Mark was free to approach her. Meanwhile, Mark watched from afar, amused. He saw the squad car come and go. He watched Daniel leave for work the next day, tense and distracted. Mark decided it was time to get even closer. That evening, Allison returned home from the courthouse to find something chilling. A small, square photograph tucked into the crack of her front door. It was a recent picture of her and Daniel laughing together at a sidewalk cafe. Taken from a distance. On the back, scrawled in ink, "See you soon. See you." Allison collapsed against the doorframe, the photo trembling in her hand. Daniel took immediate action after finding Allison trembling against the doorframe, clutching the photo. He installed a new security system, motion sensors, cameras, reinforced locks, all within a frantic 12 hours. Allison appreciated his effort, but deep down, she knew it wasn't enough. Mark wasn't just lurking, he was planning. The next few days dragged in a haze of anxiety. Allison called the courthouse twice daily, desperate for an update on the restraining order. Each time she was told the same thing. The paperwork was pending judicial review. Meanwhile, Mark escalated. One afternoon, as Allison left work, she found her car vandalized. Someone had slashed her tires, not all four, just two, and carved a deep, deliberate line across her driver's side door. There was no note this time, no message needed. The school principal, seeing her distress, suggested reviewing security footage, but the cameras on that side of the parking lot had been out of order for weeks. A maintenance request had been filed months ago and forgotten in budget cuts. Daniel wanted her to quit immediately. "Stay home until this is over," he urged. But Allison refused. She wouldn't let Mark take her career too, not again. That night, Daniel and Allison sat at the kitchen table, tension thick in the air. Daniel suggested they temporarily leave town, maybe stay with his sister across the state. Allison considered it, truly, but something gnawed at her. Running wouldn't fix this. Mark would simply follow, or wait. No, she decided. This had to end here. The next morning, Allison made her own move. She contacted a private investigator, a retired sheriff's deputy named Owen Briggs, and hired him to find out exactly where Mark was living and what he was planning. If the system wouldn't protect her, she would protect herself. Meanwhile, Mark, growing restless, decided to get closer still. Late one night, while Daniel was at a business dinner and Allison was home alone, Mark approached the house. Through the living room window, he could see her, curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, reading. So ordinary, so defenseless. He lingered outside for several minutes, soaking in the scene. Then, without warning, he rang the doorbell. Allison froze. The doorbell rang again. She peered through the peephole but saw no one. The camera footage, reviewed later, would show a shadow just out of frame. Deliberate. Allison didn't open the door. She backed away, heart pounding, and called 911. By the time officers arrived, there was no sign of Mark, just the lingering smell of cigarette smoke on the porch and a boot print smeared on the mat. Owen Briggs moved quickly. Within 2 days, he confirmed that Mark was renting a shabby apartment in Everwood under the alias Martin Reese. It was a studio above a pawn shop, paid month to month in cash. No paper trail Allison could use in court. Briggs also uncovered something more alarming. Mark had recently purchased a handgun from a private seller. No background check, no serial number. When Owen met with Allison in a quiet corner booth at a diner to deliver the news, she felt the air drain from her lungs. "This isn't harassment anymore," Owen said grimly. "This is preparation." Meanwhile, Mark grew impatient. The surveillance, the psychological games, they weren't giving him the satisfaction he craved. He wanted to see Allison's fear up close. One evening, while Allison was preparing dinner, Daniel stepped out to pick up a bottle of wine. Alone in the house, Allison heard something, a faint knock, not at the front door this time, but at the back. Her stomach tightened. She crept toward the kitchen window, careful not to expose herself. Outside, in the dim light of the backyard, she saw a shape moving near the fence. It was Mark. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she knew. The way he moved, the casual arrogance in his stance, it was him. He lingered just long enough to make sure she saw him. Then he raised one hand in a slow, mocking wave before disappearing into the night. By the time Daniel returned, Allison was hysterical. They called the police again, but as before, Mark had vanished without a trace. Later that night, Daniel sat with his head in his hands at the kitchen table. "This is going to get worse," he said finally. "We have to be ready." For the first time, Daniel suggested buying a firearm. Allison recoiled instinctively. She hated guns, hated everything they symbolized from her past life with Mark. But a small, logical voice in her head whispered, "This is survival now, not principle." Meanwhile, Mark was making plans of his own. Using stolen credentials from a former cellmate, he secured a job doing night shifts at a trucking company, giving him an excuse to be out late and explain any movements to his parole officer. It was a perfect cover. And during those long hours alone, he rehearsed what would come next. A confrontation, a reckoning, that he would control completely. The morning after Mark appeared at the fence, Allison sat silently at the kitchen table while Daniel scrolled through listings for local firearms dealers. She hated every second of it. hated the necessity it symbolized. Finally, Daniel looked up. "If you want to be involved in choosing it, you need to come with me." Allison hesitated. Part of her wanted to hide, to let Daniel handle everything. But another part, the part that remembered lying helpless in a hospital bed all those years ago, refused to be powerless again. She agreed. At the gun shop, Allison's hands shook as she held a small revolver. The salesman showed her how to load it, how to aim. Daniel signed the papers, and they arranged for a concealed carry class the following week. The mandatory waiting period meant they wouldn't have the gun for 3 days. 3 days suddenly felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, Owen Briggs kept digging. He managed to snap a few photos of Mark's truck parked near Allison's house late at night, enough to establish a pattern. But when he brought the evidence to the police, they remained frustratingly cautious. "Without a restraining order in hand or a direct threat," the officer said apologetically, "there's very little we can do. We can issue a warning if we catch him nearby, but that's it." Allison's restraining order still sat in limbo. That night, Daniel insisted they sleep in shifts. One would stay awake while the other rested. They didn't say it aloud, but both knew. They were preparing for something inevitable. Across town, Mark sat in his darkened apartment, polishing the handgun he had bought. His plan had shifted slightly. The original fantasy of confronting Allison alone was no longer enough. Daniel, he decided, had to be dealt with too. Daniel represented everything Mark hated: stability, safety, the life he believed was stolen from him. It wasn't just about Allison anymore. It was about erasing the life she had built without him. The next day, Mark took a final step. He stole an old uniform jacket from his trucking job, a nondescript blue with a generic logistics company logo. With it, he could blend in, just another delivery driver, invisible in suburban neighborhoods. At dawn, he parked 2 blocks away from Allison's house, watching, waiting. Allison inside could feel it, the heaviness in the air, the sense that their hours of preparation were running out. The next 2 nights passed without incident, but the silence only heightened the tension. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent jolts of fear through Allison's body. By day, she tried to function normally, going to work, checking the mailbox, making dinner, but her hands trembled, her head ached constantly, and she struggled to sleep even when it was her turn to rest. Daniel wasn't doing much better. The burden of vigilance wore on him. He started snapping over minor things: a misplaced set of keys, a forgotten grocery item. Each small argument chipped away at the solidarity they had clung to. Meanwhile, Owen Briggs called with urgent news. "I found something you need to see," he said. They met again at the same diner. Owen slid a folder across the table. Inside were surveillance photos, not just of Mark watching their house, but of him practicing, in an abandoned lot, drawing and aiming his weapon. He had clearly been rehearsing. "He's not just planning to scare you," Owen said. His voice was grim. "He's planning to kill." Allison sat back, the folder slipping from her fingers. The final threads holding her together seemed to snap. "We have to leave," Daniel said fiercely. "Today. I don't care where. Anywhere but here." But Allison hesitated. What if leaving gives him more reason to follow? To escalate? Owen leaned in. "He's escalating either way." They decided to pack a few essentials and leave the next morning, before sunrise. Allison barely slept that night, lying awake with the loaded revolver on the nightstand. Unbeknownst to them, Mark had already advanced to the next stage of his plan. That evening, he scoped out the blind spots around their property, noting where the cameras didn't reach. He disabled one motion sensor near the back gate with a slingshot and a small rock, shattering the lens without setting off an alarm. Inside the house, Allison and Daniel didn't even notice. At 4 a.m., Mark made his move. Disguised in his stolen delivery uniform, he approached the house with chilling calmness. A package in one hand, the gun tucked into his jacket. He knocked on the door, a firm, deliberate knock. Inside, Daniel jolted awake. "Allison!" he hissed. "Get up!" She stumbled out of bed, heart hammering. Through the peephole, Daniel saw only a figure in a delivery jacket holding a box. For a split second, doubt flickered. Maybe it was just an early morning courier, but Allison's instinct screamed otherwise. "Don't open it," she whispered. Daniel hesitated. hand on the lock. Then the figure moved, too fast, too aggressively, and Daniel understood. He grabbed the revolver from the nightstand and motioned for Allison to retreat to the bedroom. Outside, Mark tried the door handle once, twice, then drew the gun from his jacket. The confrontation had begun. Daniel backed away from the front door, keeping his body between Allison and the hallway. "Bedroom. Now," he whispered, his voice low and taut. Allison nodded, retreating as quietly as she could down the hall. Every step felt impossibly loud in the tense stillness of the house. Outside, Mark kicked the door once, testing the strength of the deadbolt. Then again, harder. The frame groaned but held. Daniel crouched behind the couch, revolver trained on the door. His heart hammered so loudly, he thought it might drown out everything else. A third kick. The deadbolt cracked, the door bursting inward with a shuddering crash. Mark rushed inside, gun raised. Daniel fired. The first shot went wide, shattering a lamp. Mark flinched but didn't fall. He dove to the side, firing back, a deafening bang that tore into the drywall inches from Daniel's head. In the bedroom, Allison crouched behind the bed, phone in hand, fingers fumbling to dial 911. She whispered into the receiver, "Home invasion, armed intruder, please, hurry." In the living room, chaos reigned. Daniel fired again, this time grazing Mark's shoulder. Mark cursed, fury overtaking calculation. He charged. They collided near the coffee table, Daniel struggling to keep control of the revolver as Mark wrestled with him. The gun clattered to the floor, spinning out of reach. Mark slammed Daniel against the wall, stunning him. Then he turned toward the hallway, toward Allison. Bleeding and furious, Mark staggered forward. Allison, hearing the scuffle grow closer, made a split-second decision. She grabbed a heavy ceramic lamp from the nightstand and crouched near the doorway. When Mark burst into the room, she swung. The lamp shattered against his head, dazing him for a split second, but not enough. He swung wildly, catching Allison across the face with the butt of his gun. She crumpled backward, vision swimming. Mark stood over her, panting, a manic gleam in his eye. "You thought you could ruin me," he spat. "You thought you could just erase me." Behind him, Daniel staggered into the room, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. Mark turned, gun raised, just as Daniel lunged. The revolver, lying forgotten near the living room, was too far away. Allison, dazed, reached blindly under the bed. Her fingers brushed cold metal, a backup weapon. Daniel's old hunting knife, forgotten after a camping trip months ago. She gripped it tight. Mark fired. Daniel stumbled, clutching his side, but kept coming. Allison rose behind Mark, knife in hand. Without thinking, without hesitating, she drove the blade into Mark's back. He froze. For a moment, time stopped. Then Mark crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Allison dropped the knife and collapsed against the wall, sobbing. Sirens wailed in the distance. When the paramedics and police finally burst through the broken door, the house was a scene of chaos. Mark lay face down in the hallway, motionless, blood soaking into the carpet. Allison sat against the wall, still clutching the empty air where the knife had been, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Daniel, pale and gasping for breath, clutched his wounded side. Officer Jessica Nolan, the same one who had first responded weeks ago, took one look and immediately called for backup. "2 injured, 1 possibly DOA," she barked into her radio. Paramedics knelt beside Mark, checking for a pulse. One of them shook his head grimly. It was over. Mark Reed was dead. Across the room, another team worked frantically on Daniel. The bullet had entered near his ribcage but missed his vital organs by inches. He was bleeding badly, but he was alive. For now. Allison couldn't speak. She could barely move. A blanket was draped over her shoulders, but she barely registered it. Everything seemed distant, unreal, like she was floating outside of her body. An officer sat beside her and gently, methodically, began asking questions. "Did you know the intruder?" "Yes," Allison croaked. "My ex-husband." The words felt foreign coming out of her mouth, like she was describing someone else's nightmare. Daniel was loaded into an ambulance, lights flashing, siren wailing. Allison was taken separately, not in handcuffs, but still in the back of a patrol car, standard protocol after a violent death. At the hospital, Allison was checked for a concussion and minor injuries. A social worker arrived to walk her through the next steps: questioning, statements, evidence collection. It all blurred together. Meanwhile, the house became an active crime scene. Evidence markers dotted the floors, the shattered door, the blood spatter, the broken furniture, all captured in photographs. Owen Briggs arrived on scene later that morning after hearing the police scanner traffic. He stood silently outside the crime tape, a grim expression on his face. He had warned them. He had tried. In a sterile interview room at the police station, Allison gave her statement. Officer Nolan listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly letting Allison talk. When she finished, Nolan leaned back, voice softer. From everything we can see, this was self-defense, but there will be an investigation. That's the law. Allison nodded numbly. She understood. It didn't make it any easier. Later, a detective dropped a heavy folder on the table. Crime scene photos, witness statements, Owen's surveillance evidence. It was a complete picture, one that showed a system that had failed to protect her until it was too late. Back at the hospital, Daniel underwent surgery to repair the internal damage. Doctors were cautiously optimistic. Allison sat beside his bed, holding his hand, feeling the first raw waves of grief, guilt, and fury crash over her. Mark was dead, but the scars he left behind, physical, emotional, legal, were only just beginning to reveal themselves. The first 48 hours after the attack were a blur for Allison. At the hospital, Daniel underwent surgery to remove the bullet and repair the internal bleeding. Doctors remained cautiously optimistic, but warned of a long, painful recovery. Allison stayed by his side, barely sleeping, her mind replaying the events over and over. The stab, the way Mark's body fell, the blood, the hollow look in his eyes. No matter how much she told herself she had no choice, the guilt gnawed at her like acid. On the second day, Detective Larson, lead investigator for the case, arrived at the hospital to speak with her again. He was methodical, respectful, but direct. "We're conducting a standard review," he said. "It looks clear-cut, but we have to follow procedure. There will be an autopsy, ballistics reports, and a final assessment by the district attorney." Allison nodded mechanically. She understood. Intellectually, it made sense, but it still felt like being under suspicion. Another invasion she hadn't asked for. Meanwhile, the local news had picked up the story, "Violent home invasion ends in fatality." The headlines blared. Most reports were sympathetic, painting Allison and Daniel as survivors. But a few sensationalized it, focusing on the death, the previous marriage to Mark, the restraining order that came too late. Reporters showed up outside the hospital. A news van idled at the end of the parking lot. Allison kept her head down, her hood up, moving like a ghost through the hallways. Owen Briggs remained a steady presence. He checked in daily, sometimes bringing coffee or updates. He had submitted all his evidence to the authorities, the surveillance photos, the proof of Mark's gun purchase. But now, like Allison, he could only wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Daniel woke briefly 2 days after surgery. His first words, hoarse and pained, were, "Are you okay?" Allison broke down in tears. They had survived, but they were not unscathed. The district attorney's office contacted her a few days later. A formal hearing would be scheduled to review the circumstances. It wasn't a trial, not yet, but it could lead to one if the DA deemed it necessary. Allison's lawyer, a woman named Carla Simmons, was blunt during their first meeting. "Self-defense cases are rarely black and white," she said. "You have a strong case, but public pressure, politics, mistakes in perception, any of it could complicate things." Allison listened numbly. She had no strength left for anger, only a grim determination to see it through. At home, the physical damage was being repaired. A locksmith reinforced the doors, and a cleaning crew scrubbed away the bloodstains. But no amount of bleach or paint could erase the memories embedded in the walls. Every night, when Allison closed her eyes, she saw Mark's face. Not the face of the man she had once loved, but the face of the monster he had become. And sometimes, just for a moment, she wondered if she had killed him too late, or too soon. The hearing date was set, 3 weeks from the attack. During those 3 weeks, Allison lived in limbo. She spent her days moving between the hospital and home, tending to Daniel's slow recovery, managing lawyer meetings, and dodging reporters who camped outside their street like vultures. Public opinion had started to split. Some neighbors left sympathy cards on the porch. Others, emboldened by distorted headlines, muttered that maybe it didn't have to end in death. Online, the speculation was even worse. Armchair analysts dissected her marriage to Mark, questioned her credibility, and accused her of playing the victim. Daniel tried to protect her from it. He stayed off social media, muted the news, but Allison couldn't unhear the whispers at the grocery store or unsee the glances when she walked into town. At night, she dreamt of Mark. Not just the attack, but the years before it. The charming young man she had once loved, who had gradually decayed into someone unrecognizable. She woke up gasping, the sheets tangled around her, drenched in sweat. Daniel's wounds were healing physically, but emotionally, he wasn't whole either. There were moments when she caught him staring into space, hand unconsciously grazing his side where the bullet had torn through. He flinched at sudden noises, kept checking the locks obsessively. Their conversations grew shorter, their silences longer. It wasn't that they blamed each other, it was that they didn't know how to comfort each other through the kind of trauma that words couldn't touch. Owen Briggs continued to check in, offering updates from the investigators. According to him, the evidence overwhelmingly supported Allison's account. Forced entry, video surveillance, the stolen firearm traced to Mark's black market purchase. Still, the final decision lay with the district attorney, and politics often played a role no evidence could erase. Carla Simmons prepared Allison for the hearing with brutal honesty. Even if the DA declines to press charges, you should be prepared for a civil suit from Mark's family, she warned. They'll see blood money. They usually do. The thought of facing Mark's family in court, people who had defended him, excused him, made Allison's stomach churn. Meanwhile, Owen discovered that one of the news outlets had filed a Freedom of Information request for the police reports, seeking to publish the grisly details. There would be no privacy. Not really. Not anymore. One afternoon, when Daniel was asleep, Allison stood alone in their living room. She stared at the repaired front door, the new locks, the fresh paint on the walls. From the outside, the house looked untouched, ordinary, as if none of it had happened. Inside, it was a different world, a fragile shell barely holding back the weight of everything they had endured. She wasn't sure if it would ever truly feel like home again. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray, as if the sky itself refused to offer any comfort. Allison dressed carefully, dark slacks, a simple blouse, no jewelry. Carla had advised her, "You want to look respectful, ordinary, someone who didn't want this, but survived it." Daniel insisted on accompanying her, despite his lingering weakness. He walked with a cane now, each step slow and painful. As they approached the courthouse, news cameras clicked like gunfire, microphones thrust forward. "Allison, do you regret killing your husband? Were you afraid for your life? Was this revenge?" The questions stabbed like needles. Daniel gritted his teeth and pushed through the throng, shielding her as best he could. Inside the courthouse, the air felt sterile, buzzing with fluorescent light and hushed murmurs. Allison spotted Owen Briggs seated quietly in the gallery, a silent pillar of support. The hearing itself was procedural, not theatrical. No jury, no dramatic testimony. Just Allison, her lawyer, the DA's representative, and the judge. Carla presented their case succinctly. Forced entry, overwhelming evidence of premeditated violence, immediate threat to life. She played security footage of Mark approaching in disguise, showed photos of the broken door, forensic reports confirming the bullet wounds and stolen weapon. The DA's office didn't argue the facts. They questioned intent. Why use a knife? Why not flee the house? Allison answered calmly, voice shaking only once. There was no time. I acted to protect myself and my husband. I didn't think. I just acted. There was a pause in the room after she spoke, a heavy, thoughtful silence. After 2 agonizing hours, the judge announced the decision. No criminal charges would be filed. Allison felt her knees weaken. Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Outside, the media swarmed again. Carla whisked them past the reporters into a waiting car, but the damage was already done. Headlines would spin the story for weeks, dissecting every word, every emotion that flickered across Allison's face. That evening, sitting at their kitchen table, Allison thought she might finally feel relief. Instead, a hollow numbness settled over her. Daniel opened a bottle of wine to celebrate the victory, but Allison barely touched her glass. She watched the candle flicker between them and realized something chilling. Winning didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving, and surviving was exhausting. Later that night, the doorbell rang. Allison and Daniel froze. This time, it was a courier, a legitimate one, delivering an envelope from a law firm. Inside was the expected but still devastating notice. Mark's family was filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Allison, seeking damages for emotional suffering and loss of familial support. The paper trembled in Allison's hand. There would be no clean ending, no quiet fade to normalcy, just more battles, more scars. The war wasn't over. It had simply changed form. The civil suit weighed heavier on Allison than she anticipated. It wasn't just the fear of financial ruin, though that was real enough. It was the implication buried within the lawsuit's language, that Mark was the victim now, that his death, despite everything he had done, was something she should answer for. Carla Simmons explained the grim math during their first strategy meeting. They'll frame it as an unnecessary use of force. They'll argue you had other options, fleeing, hiding, waiting for police. They'll paint Mark as a lost soul, a man failed by the system. Their goal isn't justice, it's sympathy. Sympathy equals money. Allison sat stiffly across from her, jaw clenched. She understood the game. It didn't make it hurt any less. Meanwhile, Daniel's recovery plateaued. The bullet wound healed physically, but emotionally he seemed adrift. He spent long hours sitting in the backyard staring at nothing, nursing a quiet anger that never quite found a voice. They spoke less now. Arguments flared over small things, an unwashed dish, a forgotten appointment. But it wasn't about the dishes. It was about everything else they didn't know how to say. One night, after a particularly brutal silence, Daniel finally spoke. "I don't know how to be normal anymore," he said. His voice was low, cracked. "I don't know how we're supposed to come back from this." Allison wanted to tell him that she understood, that she felt the same, but the words tangled in her throat. All she could do was reach for his hand across the table. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. Outside, the world kept spinning. Articles continued to surface, some sympathetic, others vicious. One online blog posted an op-ed accusing Allison of escalating the situation. Another floated conspiracy theories, that she had lured Mark back intentionally for revenge. Allison stopped reading after that. She deleted her social media accounts and changed her phone number. Even Owen Briggs, ever vigilant, warned her that no matter what the court decided, the public would have its own verdict. Preparations for the civil trial began. Depositions, paperwork, endless meetings. Carla coached Allison on how to testify, how to remain composed under hostile questioning. "You'll feel like they're attacking you," Carla said bluntly. "Because they are." Each night, Allison lay awake replaying every choice, every movement in those final moments. The knife, the blood, the hollow thud of Mark's body collapsing. Had there been another way? Could she have disarmed him? Waited longer? Hidden better? The logical part of her knew the answer. The emotional part didn't care. The guilt was a living thing now, heavy and inescapable. Daniel noticed the way she withdrew, the way shadows grew under her eyes. But he didn't push. Maybe he didn't have the strength left either. The house that once symbolized safety now felt like a tomb, too quiet, too clean, like a crime scene scrubbed but never truly erased. The civil trial loomed ahead like a storm cloud, darkening everything. And deep down, Allison understood. Even if she won again, there would be no true victory. Only survival. And survival, she had learned, had its own endless cost. The civil trial began in a smaller courtroom than the criminal hearing. but the tension was no less suffocating. Mark's family sat on one side, a few rows of stiff-backed mourners dressed in somber black. His mother wept openly as the proceedings started, a deliberate, visible grief that seemed to color the air in the room. Allison, seated beside Carla Simmons, kept her gaze low, focused on a fixed spot on the table in front of her. The plaintiff's lawyer wasted no time in painting Mark as a misunderstood man, a man failed by society and destroyed by emotional turmoil. They didn't deny the break-in, but they framed it as a desperate act, a cry for help that ended tragically because Allison had chosen violence. They showed old photographs of Mark smiling at family gatherings, reports of minor achievements from years before the violence, and carefully omitted his criminal history. They suggested, subtly but persistently, that Allison could have done more to de-escalate, that she could have hidden, that calling 911 should have been enough. It was a masterclass in reframing. Allison's chest tightened painfully as she listened. When it was Carla's turn, she presented the grim realities, the forced entry, the armed threat, the documented stalking campaign, Owen Briggs's surveillance reports, the broken door, the bloodstains, Allison's own 911 call. Her panicked, breathless voice captured forever on a recording played for the court. "She didn't choose violence," Carla said in closing. "Violence chose her." Still, Allison could feel the uncertainty lingering in the room. The emotional narrative always weighed heavier than the factual one. When Allison took the stand, her voice was steady but flat. She answered every question truthfully, but without drama. She described the fear, the attack, the moment she realized Mark would kill them both if she didn't act. Mark's family's attorney tried to break her composure, implying she had harbored secret anger all these years, that she had been waiting for an excuse. Allison simply said, "I wanted to live." Daniel was there for every session, sitting silently in the back, pale and drawn. His presence gave her strength, but it also hurt, a reminder of how fragile they both had become. The trial stretched into the second week. Every day, Allison felt herself shrinking a little more, withdrawing inside herself to survive the endless retelling of horror. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Headlines continued to twist the story to fit whichever narrative sold best. One particularly cruel article speculated that Allison had baited Mark, suggesting she had lured him back into her life through subconscious signals. It was absurd, but it spread like wildfire online. Owen Briggs tried to shield her from it. Daniel tried to protect her from it, but it seeped into everything. At home, the tension became unbearable. One night, after returning from a brutal cross-examination session, Allison found Daniel packing a small duffel bag. "I just need a few days," he said. His voice was hollow. "I can't breathe here anymore." Allison didn't argue. She just nodded, feeling something inside her crack wide open. She sat on the edge of the bed after he left, staring at the wall. Even survival had its price, and Allison was starting to wonder if it was a price she could truly afford. The day before closing arguments, Allison sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the shell of the life she had built, the home that no longer felt like home. Daniel hadn't called. He hadn't texted. Part of her was angry. Part of her understood too well why he couldn't stay. The civil trial had taken everything from her: energy, privacy, even memory. Some days, she couldn't remember what life had felt like before the invasion. It was as if her entire identity had collapsed into one terrible night and the endless aftermath. Carla visited briefly in the evening to prepare her final testimony. "You'll need to sit in court tomorrow," she said. "Silent, composed. Let the judge see you're not running from any of this." Allison nodded. She no longer had the strength to argue. The next morning, the courthouse felt different, heavy, expectant. Even the reporters were quieter, sensing the end was near. The plaintiff's attorney gave a closing statement that dripped with emotional appeals. A young man struggling with trauma, cut down too soon. A woman who, instead of seeking compassion, chose violence. A tragedy, plain and simple. Allison felt physically sick listening to it, even as she knew how twisted the narrative was. Then Carla stood. She didn't match emotion with emotion. Instead, she laid out the cold, brutal facts once again. Mark Reed broke into a home where he was unwelcome. He brought a gun. He had a history of violence. Allison had no duty to run, no duty to hide, no duty to sacrifice herself. She ended simply, "It was a tragedy, but it was not her crime." The judge promised a verdict within 48 hours. Allison barely made it to the parking lot before her legs gave out. She sat on the curb, head between her knees, trying to force air into her lungs. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The well of tears had long since dried up. That evening, Owen Briggs stopped by, uninvited but welcome. He didn't offer platitudes or promises. He just sat with her on the back porch, two old folding chairs creaking under the weight of things neither of them could fix. "You did what you had to do," Owen said finally, voice low. "Doesn't mean it won't hurt like hell anyway." She nodded, grateful for the honesty. Hours passed in silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of passing cars. Inside the house, the court documents, the newspaper clippings, the medical bills. They all waited like open wounds. The world had moved on without her. Allison realized she had changed at some fundamental level. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into her home months ago, expecting nothing worse than a quiet night with her husband. She had survived something unimaginable. But survival, she now understood, wasn't a triumph. It was a scar you learned to live with. Whether the court ruled in her favor or not, whether the public believed her or not, the real battle would be the quiet war she would fight inside her own mind for years to come. And she would fight it alone. 2 days later, Allison stood once again inside the sterile courtroom. The world outside her narrowed to a few square feet of cold linoleum and buzzing fluorescent lights. The judge read the decision without ceremony. The court found in Allison's favor. No damages awarded. No judgment against her. A few words spoken in under 2 minutes that legally closed the case. The plaintiff's table remained rigid, Mark's mother pressing a handkerchief to her mouth, trembling. Allison didn't look at them. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Nothing that would bridge the yawning chasm between their grief and her reality. Outside, the press waited again, but Carla Simmons steered her through a side exit, sparing her the spectacle. In the parking lot, Owen Briggs waited leaning against his truck, arms folded, a quiet shield against the world. "It's over," he said simply. Allison nodded, but she knew better. The trial was over. The war inside her was not. When she got home that afternoon, the house felt more foreign than ever. The silence inside was dense, not peaceful, a heavy, suffocating thing that filled every corner. Daniel's absence was a wound that ached deeper now. No texts, no calls, no sign of return. Allison sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the backyard where they had once talked about planting a garden. She hadn't realized until now how much of her healing had been tethered to the idea that if they survived this together, they could rebuild together. Now, survival felt strangely hollow. Later that evening, Allison stood at the kitchen sink, mindlessly rinsing a glass, when she saw headlights flash across the driveway. For a moment, her chest seized in panic, instinct, trauma responding faster than reason. Then she recognized the car. Daniel. He stepped out slowly, looking thinner, older somehow. He held no suitcase, no flowers, no dramatic apology, just himself, fragile, uncertain. Allison met him at the door. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel's voice broke the silence. "I'm not sure how to fix this," he said. "I'm not even sure we can." Allison swallowed hard. Me either. There were no tears, no accusations, just two people standing in the ruins of the life they once tried to build. He stepped inside. She didn't stop him. But she didn't move to embrace him either. They were both different now, cracked in places that might never heal right. That night, Daniel slept in the spare bedroom, a silent, heavy truce. Allison lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that survival had changed them both in ways they hadn't fully begun to understand. Outside, the night was cold and quiet. Inside, two people who once loved each other tried, in their broken, tentative way, to exist side by side again, not as who they were, but as whatever was left. The days that followed the verdict passed slowly, uneventfully, yet each felt weighted with meaning. Daniel stayed, but it wasn't the same as before. They moved around each other carefully, like strangers in a shared space. Meals were silent. Nights were long. The touchstones that had once defined their relationship, easy laughter, casual touches, quiet comfort, were conspicuously absent. There were no arguments, no confrontations, just a mutual, heavy understanding. They had both survived, but not without damage neither could easily name or mend. Allison spent more time outside, sitting on the back steps with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring out into the skeletal trees. Winter had begun to creep in, the air brittle and raw. One evening, Daniel joined her. They sat in silence for a long time before he spoke. "I think we should sell the house," he said quietly. Allison didn't answer right away. She knew he was right. This place, once their sanctuary, had become a graveyard of memories. Every room held echoes of that night, of fear, of violence. Moving wouldn't erase it, but maybe it would loosen the noose around their necks. Eventually, she nodded. Okay. It was the first decision they made together in months. The process of packing up their life was slow and painful. Sorting through wedding photos, books, holiday decorations, everything was tinged with a kind of muted grief. Some days Daniel would disappear for hours, driving aimlessly. Some nights Allison would wake from nightmares so vivid she could still feel Mark's hands reaching for her. And yet through it all, there was a tiny, stubborn ember of something still alive inside her. Not hope, not yet, but a willingness to keep breathing, to keep moving. The night before they closed on the sale, Allison stood alone in the empty living room. She pressed her palm against the cool wall, feeling the house's heartbeat, or maybe just her own. "I'm sorry," she whispered. To herself, to Daniel, to whoever she had been before all of this. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. She simply turned, picked up her bag, and walked out without looking back. Daniel was waiting by the car. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. They drove in silence toward a small rental apartment 2 towns over, where no one knew their names, where no headlines whispered behind their backs. The future was uncertain. Their relationship was uncertain. Allison didn't know if they would make it, or if they would simply drift apart under the quiet weight of everything left unsaid. But for the first time in months, she understood something essential. Survival wasn't about erasing the past. It was about carrying it, and somehow, learning to live anyway. As the town disappeared in the rearview mirror, Allison closed her eyes. She hadn't won, but she hadn't lost either. She was still here, and sometimes that was enough.